Well, thank you, Amy, for that introduction, and thank you, Judith. And thanks to the Iowa International Center generally for the great work that you do building community and cultivating understanding and celebrating diversity here in Iowa. This talk is offered in that same vein. An alternate title could be, Who are the people in your neighborhood? Religion edition. My area of expertise is in medieval Christianity, and there's not a whole lot of that in this neighborhood, but I focus in particular on the marginalized and underrepresented and often persecuted groups and individuals of the European Middle Ages. And I know where religious intolerance ultimately leads, to the stake. Unfortunately, we can do so much better here and now, thanks in no small part to our representative democracy and our constitutional rights, with our very first right guaranteed in our Bill of Rights being religious freedom. Freedom from a state church, and freedom to practice your religion according to your own conscience. And that includes the freedom not to practice or to believe at all. I am an outsider to all of the communities I'm going to be discussing today, so you're not getting a first-hand account of what it's like to be a member of these communities. But I offer this more as an outsider's brief introduction to the incredible religious diversity that enriches our state and often goes unrecognized. And sometimes when it is recognized, it causes feelings of alienation and resentment because people aren't sure what this diversity means for them and they feel threatened by it. So I've got two main purposes for giving this talk. One is I really find religious diversity incredibly fascinating, and I hope you will too. But I also want to help minimize those feelings of alienation and resentment just because somebody is different from you. I'm hoping that by increasing your familiarity with people who are different, you'll see them less as the other and more like your neighbor, right here with you, dedicated to life here in Iowa. We didn't want that to happen, Amy, did we? Okay, we'll come back. Hopefully. Okay, so in order to keep the talk a manageable amount of time, I have to omit far more than I include, and these omissions in no way suggest any disrespect, or I think that other things aren't as important. I'd like to thank two of my former students who, I'm going to unplug this and replug this because it got all wonky. Madison Fiddler and Hannah Landgraf, who worked with me on an earlier version of this presentation that we gave at the American Academy of Religion. And they're not here with us today because Maddie just started her third year of law school in New Hampshire, and Hannah recently received her Master's of Divinity at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta. So they're clearly going on to do great work, but they're not here with me now. I also want to thank the members of all the different communities that I spoke with and visited, and especially those who took the time to be interviewed by me for this purpose, or by my students. And I encourage you all to get to know these communities for yourselves, but always keep in mind, if you're going to visit their religious sites, first of all, remember it's their sacred space, and so you really want to be respectful of that. But you also definitely want to be in contact with them in advance so that you can make sure it's a mutually convenient time and that you know what to expect. Okay, so Iowa's not known for its religious diversity, or any kind of diversity. We are over 85% European American, or white, and we are over 75% Christian, or at least that's how we self-identify. So when I teach courses on religious diversity, I regularly get asked by Iowans, do we have that here? And the short answer is yes, and this list is far from exhaustive of the kinds of religious diversity that we have here. And we've had this diversity going back to our earliest history, which of course begins with the indigenous peoples and their wide range of perspectives. But even if we just limit it to when Iowa was opened up as a territory, and Iowa's first known planned community was a place called Salubria, which was based on the premise of religious freedom, and so consequently has been known by some Christian historians as the infidel colony. It was the brainchild of a man named Abner Neeland, who was born 2 years before the United States became a nation, and he died 2 years before Iowa became a state. He lived most of his life back east. He was a Baptist who then became a Universalist, as in the Universalist and Unitarian Universalist, and then he became a pantheist, which means he saw the divine as permeating all of creation, but not as being separate from the natural world. He published his views in the newspaper, which is called The Investigator, and had the motto, "Hear all sides, then decide." Well, the authorities heard what he had to say and decided it sounded a lot like atheism, which was a crime at the time. And he vigorously rejected this label because he wasn't an atheist. He was a pantheist. And so the powers that be said, all right, maybe it's not atheism, but it sure is blasphemy as far as we're concerned. So they imprisoned him for blasphemy. He is the last person who was imprisoned for blasphemy in the United States. And the experience inspired him to build a better way, which he did in southeastern Iowa with his colony, Salubria. Unfortunately, the colony did not survive him when he died 5 years later. But the example he set of coming out to Iowa so that you can live in accordance with your own religious convictions, and sometimes doing so in community, is an example that has been repeated many times. Most famously with the Amana inspirationists, also known as the Amana colonists. The Amana community, or the community of true inspiration, began in the early 18th century in Germany and Switzerland. It comes out of the Pietist movement, particularly a Lutheran expression of Pietism. And they came over first to New York, but then they decided they wanted more room and less people, so they came to Iowa in 1855. They practiced a form of communal living that saw the chaste celibate as the most virtuous way of life. But they did allow for marriage and family, but if you got married, you were demoted. So the way that status was shown was where you were sitting. So Jordan back there, you would be in the back of the church. Seth would be the chaste celibate. I know that's not true, he's my husband, so, but anyway, we can pretend. Okay. But say he got married to me, he'd get moved to the back, right? And then over time, he could gain some status until he had kids. He's got 2, so he's going back a couple times, but you get the idea. In 1932, they abandoned communal living. This is known as the Great Change, and they've seen a number of other changes as well. Starting in 1961, they started using English in the worship services as opposed to German. They still have German services, but the English services are better attended now than the German ones are. Starting in 1987, they allowed female elders. They had their first female elder, and at least as of a few years ago, 4 of the 10 elders were female. They are an interesting combination of embracing tradition while also embracing modernity. And as far as when I spoke with different communities, I asked them, what's the one thing you'd like to say to people in this kind of a presentation? And so one of them wanted you to know that we are committed Christians who believe that God wants us to truly love our neighbors, and thus we do not judge or condemn. We believe in inclusion, not exclusion. They don't engage in interfaith relationships. They don't deliberately engage in those with non-Christians, but they do have a range of relations with the Meskwaki, the Native American tribe in the same area as Amana. And there's actually some evidence that these connections with the Meskwaki predate their time in Iowa, and it might be that they chose this region in Iowa because of these connections with the Meskwaki that they had since their time in New York. The Meskwaki are the only federally recognized American Indian tribe in Iowa, but they are not our only Indians. We also have a growing Indian American population. which in 2005 realized what one member called the 4 decades old dream of about 1,000 Indian families who have settled here. If you have not been to this temple, I cannot encourage you enough to go visit it. It is such a treasure of Iowa. It's absolutely gorgeous. It took them 3 years to build it, and the artisans were all from India, and they were supported by the community. The community raised the money for this themselves. It's tremendous dedication. The artisans were all from India. The material, they're all from Iowa. So there's a nice connection of the Iowa international elements here. India is, of course, an incredibly diverse country, but there are 2 main cultural poles, the north and the south. And when you go into the main sanctuary, you'll see this reflected in the sanctuary, where all the gods and goddesses on the western side of the temple are all white, reflecting the cultural influences of the north, and all those on the eastern side are dark, reflecting the cultural influences of the south. And they have a priest who specializes in the language and the customs of the north, and they have a priest who specializes in the language and the customs of the south. Now, to drastically oversimplify, as you would with any religion if you're trying to explain it in like 3 minutes or less, Hinduism can be said to have 3 main gods, known as the Trimurti. You have Brahma, who's the creator, you have Vishnu, who's the preserver, and then you have Shiva, who's the destroyer. The main god in this temple is Balaji, who is a form of Vishnu. Vishnu, as the preserver, will come to earth whenever there's great need for him in the form of different avatars. And so you've got Balaji, and then on either side he's flanked by Rama and Krishna, who are probably the most beloved avatars of Vishnu. But the other avatars are shown as well surrounding them. And as exquisite and unique and glorious as this temple is, it is not Iowa's only Hindu temple. We have at least 3 others, one in Cedar Rapids, one in Council Bluffs, and one in Fairfield. Another religion that originated in India and is very well represented here in Iowa is Buddhism. And part of the reason why we have such incredible diversity, and we do, I'm only focusing on Des Moines here because there's so many different kinds of Buddhism to talk about here in Iowa, but a great part of the reason why we have this wonderful diversity is thanks to Governor Robert Reid, who in the 1970s took a very courageous political stand by enabling Iowa to be declared a refugee resettlement area and establishing the organization that is now known as the Iowa Bureau of Refugee Services, which continues to do great work and make Iowa a beacon of hope for so many people. And I'm going to, I can't get in depth with all of the different groups, but I'll start here with the Wat Lao Temple, and these pictures barely do justice to how beautiful this temple is and how much there is to learn from visiting it. This is a form of Theravada Buddhism, more monastic form of Buddhism. That's on East Park. On Southwest 9, we have Tu Vien Hong Duc, which is a form of Vietnamese Pure Land Buddhism. And I'd like now, hopefully technology will work, to play this brief video that was made through the auspices of Drake University's Comparison Project, which is a great resource for learning about religious diversity in Des Moines. And one of the things that they do is they enable members of these different groups to create these kind of videos. Okay, so this is a video starring 2 young girls who are members of this temple and talking about their religious tradition and talking about their temple. All of the pictures are taken at the temple. So just so you know, this is right here, right now. Okay? And hopefully it will work. I pray to the gods, but that's not a Buddhist thing to do, so.
These classes provided by the temple give old age, disease, and death. A Buddha is understood as a person who was awake from a deep sleep of knowledge. After his death, the community where he found a religious ruler. At the temple, there is classical beginning and a classical order and more advanced grade. But a person of any age can come and learn here. We have little kid, middle school kid, and high school student, college student. It is important for us to learn how our religion started and where our culture comes from.
We see the little kids as a new generation. They will learn what we learn after us. When my little brother gets older, he will go to the Luis class and learn all about the Buddha and the importance of equality in life.
Okay. So when I spoke with the head of that temple, the gentleman that the girls refer to as their master, the one thing he'd like you to know is you don't have to believe in Buddha. Just cultivate peace and happiness and well-being. There are many different ways to do so. Different Buddhas help people learn paths that work for them, like intellect or compassion, but different faiths can do that too. This temple grew out of another Vietnamese temple that we have just north of Drake. And then we also have the Des Moines Zen Center, which began to meet in the 1980s and has had a number of different locations, but is now on 35th Street, just north of Ingersoll. Most of the members of this community are of European descent, and they don't have all that much interaction with the different Asian Buddhist communities here in Des Moines, but they are closely affiliated with a monastery in Japan, to which some of the members have traveled, including Edo, their priest, who's received Dharma transmission there. As far as the one thing that one of the people I spoke with would like you to know is there's a range in every religion. You will find people in the same religious tradition who seem to believe opposite things or have contradictory practices. And that doesn't mean that one is right and the others are wrong, that one is the true form of the faith and all the others are fakes. And this is a particularly Buddhist point. I mean, one of the things that the Buddha is supposed to have said is, accept no one else's truth for your own. He's also, when he's asked, does his path work? He said, try it and see. If it works for you, sure, it works. Right? If not, the last Indian originating religion that I'm going to talk about is Sikhism. And there's been a formal Sikh association in Des Moines since 1982. In 1998, they bought this former house from the Jehovah's Witnesses, so there's a degree of interfaith cooperation right there. Just a couple of years ago, they were able to open their purpose-built Gurdwara in Johnston, and it is, again, like the Hindu temple, it is gorgeous, and it is a sign of their commitment. I want to note too, you can say Sikh or you can say Sikh. It goes either way. The people that I know prefer Sikh, but you know, Sikhs really aren't into forcing their views onto others. They pointed out that they prefer integration as opposed to assimilation, pointing out that, you know, the metaphor of the melting pot in which everything is boiled down into the same gelatinous goo, and that's me, not him, calling it a gelatinous goo, isn't really helpful. What he prefers is the metaphor of a salad, in which every vegetable contributes its own unique flavors and nutrients and enhances the overall goodness of the whole. And so this is an example of unity in diversity. You know, it's not about uniformity. It's about retaining your identity while finding common ground with others. The one thing that one of the people I spoke with said he would like people to know about his community is we are a peace-loving people who believe deeply in equality for all and the oneness of God, which means oneness in community. God is the creator of all, so everything and everyone are sacred. These three religions from India show some of the range in religion. We have polytheism with Hinduism. Buddhism is technically non-theistic, although there are both theistic and atheistic elements within it. Sikhism is very much a monotheistic faith, as are the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We have many different kinds of Islam here in Iowa. Sunni is by far the most common in the world, and here in Iowa, followed by Shia. We also have Sufi Muslims, who are like the mystical path of Islam, and the Nation of Islam. Islam is probably the most distrusted religion in America and in Iowa today. Consequently, Muslims are faced with a disproportionate amount of hostility and resentment directed to them by non-Muslims. This is largely because of the September 11th attacks on our country and other acts of brutality that are perpetrated around the world by Islamic extremists. The vast majority of Muslims vehemently denounce and oppose these attacks. In addition, Muslims are very frequently the first victims of such Islamic extremists who view that anyone who doesn't practice their narrow form of Islam is the enemy and needs to be eliminated. So even though the vast majority of Muslims are opposed to and denounce these attacks, and frequently are the first victims of these attacks, they are regularly blamed for these attacks by non-Muslims. When people do this, they generally discount the fact that pretty much every religion has its radical, violent extremists. And this is also something we see outside of religion and among atheists as well. But other groups aren't held as responsible for their radical extremists the way that Muslims are. This double standard was particularly apparent in 2011 when Representative Peter King of New York called for congressional hearings on the radicalization of American Muslims. Representative King of New York, not Iowa, has been an outspoken, avid supporter of the Irish Republican Army. Apparently that's okay. But being a Muslim, well, that makes you suspicious. Right? During these hearings, our first Muslim congressman, who comes from our great neighbor to the north, Minnesota, spoke eloquently and gave a shout out to Iowa. So I would like to read what he said here. This is Representative Keith Ellison. Muslim Americans have been a part of America since the nation's founding. A little-known fact is that Cedar Rapids, Iowa, is home to the oldest, and here I'd insert standing, mosque in America. The Muslim American community is just like the rest of us. Muslims serve our nation as doctors, lawyers, teachers, business owners, factory workers, cab drivers, law enforcement officers, professors, firefighters, and members of the armed forces. Muslim Americans live in every community in America. They are our neighbors. In short, they are us. The reason why I insert standing is because the Mother Mosque is regularly called the oldest mosque in America, and that's actually not true. When it opened in 1934, we had already had several different mosques, including in such unlikely places as Maine and North Dakota. And it hasn't been continuously used as a mosque anyway, either. There was a gap between the 1970s and the 1990s because they had outgrown the Mother Mosque and they built a much larger Islamic Center of Cedar Rapids. But in the 1990s, it was re-established as a mosque, and Maddie interviewed the imam there, and I want to share what he wanted to say. The secret to living in peace as a community with your neighbors is that you are willing to be part of community. Once you are willing, the community will accept you. It's like the quote, "Do not ask what my country can do for me, but rather what can I do for my country?" What can I do for my community? You need to get involved, be visible, proactive. When there is common knowledge, there is no fear. When you visit and know your neighbor, you learn the truth about them, not just what the media tells you. He also mentioned how in the wake of September 11th, the Mother Mosque received countless donations of flowers and food and other gifts from non-Muslims who wanted to stand in solidarity with the Mother Mosque and say, we know those people who attacked our country, they weren't you. Judaism, again, so much diversity. I'm only going to talk about Des Moines, and I'm not going to represent it all. There are three main branches of Judaism, and we've got a synagogue for each one. We've got Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative. The Reform started out as Orthodox, but I just ran. It's been around since 1873. The Beth El Jacob was from 1881, and Tifereth Israel is Conservative 1901. So they've been around these communities for a long time, and I'm not sure how well you can make out this picture. But one of the things I find fascinating about these communities here in Des Moines is they have made pitches to Jews outside of Des Moines and Iowa to say, come here. This is such a fabulous place to live and raise your family and be a Jew. I know both the Orthodox community and the Reform community has made pitches like that. I don't know to what. I know that it's had some success. I can't say to what extent it's been successful. The last religion I want to talk about is Wicca, which is a subset of paganism. Paganism is an umbrella term. It can be understood in lots of different ways. It applies to lots of different kinds of faith. Here it's meant primarily just as nature-oriented religion. Wicca, specifically, is a form of modern-day witchcraft. Okay? And it is probably the most misunderstood of these different faiths. And that's partly because, for many people, their first reference point for a witch is an image that was painted centuries ago by Christians who cast the witch as the incarnation of their deepest, darkest fears. They claimed that they were devil worshippers who were hell-bent on the destruction of all of society and humankind. And then they used this image to justify the torture and execution of countless thousands of women and men they called witches. So imagine your own worst enemy. Imagine they paint your picture, but intensify their hate by about 1 billion. How accurate do you think that portrait's going to be? We're dealing with same levels of accuracy when we're talking about what a lot of people think is true of witchcraft. Wicca is an incredibly diverse, complex tradition, as all of these traditions are. But if there is one basic ground rule for Wicca, it's do what you will, but harm none. As you can see, there are Wiccan groups all around the state. But it wasn't on most people's radar until this past April, when one of the representatives wanting to celebrate the diversity and inclusion of Iowa invited a Wiccan priestess to give the convocation at the Iowa House of Representatives. And that's a picture of Priestess Deborah Maynard. And she gave a lovely prayer of inclusion, seeking justice, strengthening community. But her message was largely lost on her would-be audience, as over half of the representatives deliberately did not attend her prayer. And when one of them who did attend deliberately turned his back on her in the chambers, claiming that that's what Jesus would have done. The disrespect and the hostility that she had to endure had nothing to do with how she practices her religion, and had everything to do with other people's ignorance and prejudices. And those prejudices are a real part of a religiously diverse society. Now, interestingly, the different communities that I and my students spoke to, only one talked of any significant persecution here in Iowa, and interestingly, that was the one Christian community that we talked to. But wait. They said it wasn't really because of their religion, but it was because of their ethnicity. Okay. During World War I and World War II, when the United States was at war with Germany, they were cast as the German others, which they point out is ironic because their community had been there a lot longer than most of the people pointing fingers at them as the other, and most of the people pointing fingers at them were of German descent themselves. In between my first and second visit to the Gurdwara in Valley Junction in West Des Moines, 2 Sikhs were fatally shot in California. Here in Iowa, the Hindu temple sign at one point was torn down and defaced, and the mayor was initially opposed to having a Hindu temple in Madrid, but the person became a vocal supporter of the temple and would regularly attend festivals, which I really recommend because they're lots of fun. But September 11th was a wake-up call for the non-Christian communities in particular, as pointing to the need for greater engagement and understanding. It was also a wake-up call for a young man named Kareem Rashad Sultan Khan, who's not from Iowa, he's from New Jersey. And he felt compelled to enlist in the military to prove to other Americans that Muslim Americans are just as American and just as patriotic as any other American. Unfortunately, about a year into his service in Iraq, he was killed by an IED. But his example inspired Ray Sorensen to dedicate the 2010 painting on the Freedom Rock to multi-faith, the multi-faith reality of Iowa. If you're not familiar with Freedom Rock, this is something that Ray Sorensen paints every year to celebrate and commemorate the service and sacrifices of the military, and he usually makes a connection with Iowa in particular. And so you can see Kareem Rashad Sultan Khan, that is from a photograph of him, here with his gravestone. There's a Jewish soldier and a Christian soldier as well. And there's no direct Iowa connection, but there is an indirect one, as a World War II vet named Abdullah Igram from Cedar Rapids fought for the right for Muslims to have their dog tag reflect their religious identity. When he served, you could have either P for Protestant, C for Catholic, or H for Hebrew, and other than that, you got an X. And this is a problem when your dog tag is your only means of communicating how you would like your body to be treated for burial. So he started a movement to have this recognized, starting with Eisenhower, who was not really supportive of the idea, but eventually the cause was successful. And I would like to commend the armed forces for being among the most supportive of the diverse religious needs of its members. So Iowa gets generally pretty high marks from the people that we spoke with. One of my friends who's a Hindu and has spent a lot of time in Texas wants to thank Iowans for being as welcoming and open as they are. A Vietnamese Buddhist who has traveled around the country really commends all Americans for being as open and welcoming as they are. And he is so grateful that freedom is one of our core values because it's something we extend to others. Although he notes we will complain when festivals get a little loud, as they are wont to do. And however you feel about religious diversity, the fact is it's a reality and it's increasing. All that matters is what we're going to do about it. I'm reminded of one of my students who did his research project on the Sikhs, and he called his paper, "Don't Fear the Turban," because he had feared the turban. He didn't know what the turban meant, and he thought it meant that they were radical Muslim extremists, right, which he knew to fear because of his experiences in our country with September 11th. But he got to know them, and he found them to be among the most generous, gracious, kind, hospitable people he's ever met. No matter how you feel about religious diversity, as I said, it's here and it's growing, and no matter what faith these people practice, or if they practice none at all, no matter where they come from originally, if they're here, making their home here in Iowa, they're Iowans. And as one of the people I interviewed, a Sikh who's an immigrant, said to me, he feels very much like an Iowan, especially when he's in New York. And so on that, I will thank you for your attention. I'd just like to, again, give a shout out. Here's Maddie, and this is Hannah, and they're here with Ibu Patel at an Interfaith Leadership Institute we attended in Washington, D.C. So thank you very much.